Remember what this kind of environment would be like for a human without juice, without prosthetics, but she knew it was bad. She was dour with weariness and a humming strain in her cells, which had developed after relentless days hauling and running from one unpleasant situation to the next, just to confirm destruction was certain for a numbers database back in hell. And on her tongue was the thin mucus film of modified pollen residue, which when spat out looked like purple-tinged blood and tasted like stale corn cereal. Her partner on this duty run through purgatory, loyal Rawl, languishing in the back of her throat, the famous song lyric, "I love you." She held it back there with every breath out, straining against the insidious magnitude of that old marketing slogan, which lurched itself onto the tension between her shoulders and pounding waves, trying to force it out of her. Instead, she watched Rawl move around town center like it was just for her safety and stoked the tumult in her guts, held her words to suffocate, kept her gaze close, filtered. Rawl, our destruction could be sweet, she thought stupidly. One day we'll die. They'll resurrect their terror domes and bury our embers like flicking ash off a joint. They'll pop pills and forget the earth with their made-up histories. They'll erase us, and because we built no structures and we only tried to know each other in any way, we couldn't handle that. We're burning. And I want to love you like the voice of God, whatever the fuck that means. The pining went on like this until her stoic, straight-shouldered posture collapsed suddenly. A moment's whimper for cruel reality where she would have crumpled forward completely if not for the fact that they had to keep it moving. Kay calmed herself a little bit, straightened back up, watching Rawl's beautiful hands and beautiful arms pull debris away from overgrown residential entrances, while she sorted through fragmented thoughts about salvation, about sweaty adolescent uniforms made of smelly plastic thread, and the cold of her underthighs in freezing weather, waiting for the once-an-hour bus home. Being here like this was really fucking with her. Look at them now, she mused ruefully. This partner run was straight misery. And dutiful Rawl kept on, effortlessly ignoring the direction of her eyes on him, the position of her indicator beacon a dot with a pulse, explicitly close to his on their compiled orientation map. Was he fixated on that breathing point like she was? He gave her nothing but his back and guarded side, continuing along the suggested survey path like a forest creature out to scavenge. Their silence felt like a penance. Kay observed with bitter relief how he kept space between them as they worked. A measured tandem, a professional focus. There was a deadline. And in the meantime, it was all her loud thoughts, a memory loop of the time under candlelight and the in-out flutter of muscles holding balance while they crouched, searching for the next work of background music to play while they got high. Why couldn't that be now? Why not fucking all the time? She fixated on every dreadful packet of data she could, bleeding inwardly for any acknowledgement that Rawl felt just as tortured, but what would happen if he did? Rawl stood and stepped out of the dank cave that used to be the town library, creeping gingerly away from giant, aggressive, reform fungi, the lethal mutant spores of which they could thankfully but painfully filter. And she stopped, feet together, to simply look at her. Would a drone fly by right now in that moment, it would see what looked like two adolescent boys, one copper, one clay, staring at each other from across a field once intersection of flood scum snakers and yellow stink algae. And if the drone monitor didn't recognize the two boys were surveyor dispatches, they would think, boy, they're goners like already by now. But if he did, he would see if he could access their dialogues and listen to some of their perverted body talk. A common fetish, no thanks to a popular full-conversion cyborg porn star back in the domes. But if he did, he would see, but he wouldn't get any, and by then his screen was already flipped to somewhere else because who wants to watch two surveyor cyborgs stare at each other? And for a second later from that, Rawl and Kay would do the simultaneous act of speaking and looking elsewhere, that there don't appear to be any viable, non-contaminated sites at all. This was another town to be lumped into that total collateral 260 zone, the 260 being the current business optimistic estimate of years it would take for the land to become livable for humans again. And what no one would see at all would be their awkward lingering and tight-chested breathing in the game with which they championed the art of aloof. That night they would trek the tremendous distance out of the 260 zone and back to viable forest, only to at one point stumble into a gully, overrun with massive dark root knot, jolt each other to words by the shock of taut thigh against crotch. "You did that on purpose," Kay cried on cold air, her back against the root base. Rawl hanging on to an overhead branch lest he topple entirely over, left one hand and hushed closer against Kay's body. He looked at her sadly, then not at all, the two of them silent and unmoving. She began to tremble. He nuzzled into her. "Why do this? Rawl is cruel. It's heartbreaking. Every time we gotta go to mission with each other." His other hand left the branch and she tensed against the full weight of his body, the languid warmth pushing a slow exhale from her mouth. "Tell me," she said, nudging, insisting forward. "I hate your idea that it's so bad. To me, it's worth it. I can live a whole life for you, and I can live as me when you don't exist. But that's agony. It's nothing but sighs. It's all I can think about. Thinking about you changes me till I force myself to stop obsessing and do some other shit, like search for some tenderness or whatever so I can get on. And all I want is to obsess about you, but it's not worth it. But you're regulators. You can do whatever you want. You're like the standard. You don't have to worry about that so much, Kay. You got it." "You got me, though," she thought stupidly, not saying it. Then sighed and tried pathetically to heave herself out from under him. "Get off me, please, Rawl. We got mission end tomorrow afternoon. We're doing good this season," she pleaded on. He sighed against her and then pulled himself off and away. An exhale pushed through gritted teeth. She could see him looking from solid ground at her crotch. "Then why did you switch to external when you knew that was the last thing I asked for before we decided to break?" His voice wavered with the decay of hurt feelings. She jumped to answer, only to find no words, the tongue empty, open-mouthed. She closed her eyes sadly. Then a hot compression, sharp exhale. His weight was back on her leg, back between hers, and pressing against tight fabric, and engorged flesh beneath. She gasped. She refused to look. She stretched back against him, and when she parsed the preemptive signal of heat closing in on her reactive skin cells, she wilted instead of jumped. Then his mouth on hers, awash with new sensation because they didn't kiss on purpose, and yet here they were, sinking into the abyss together. She responded in deliberate, fervent motions, muttering against wet mouth that she'd dreamed of him sucking it ever since, and she must have switched without thinking. She really, really wanted to fuck him with it. He sobbed against her, just like she dreamed of, like that voice of God, rapture, and her thoughts sunburst with flash memories of being under the old FEMA boardwalk during the drought as a girl, of setting up behind the playground twisty slide, and other sordid and confused tales of traumatic bodily desire. Rawl made her remember the feeling of the raw youth from a pedestal of control, and later she would know things about herself she hadn't even considered. She would sneer and watch him deep-throat her flesh cock and let her lie fuck his gorgeous cunt in Siberia after grappling and grunted words, after getting based and taking so very long, peeling agonizing layers away, those exchanges. They would replay in a haze back home, and she would mutter to herself what it took to make two people get off like they did. Now they writhed against each other, snakes shedding and gasped on teeth and tongue, both pausing to go further because it was dangerous out in these woods still. Till finally they wore out their brains and stopped to filter air. Rawl. Okay. Yeah, I know. Her hands tugged on his hair to breathy gasping. "You're more vigilant than I am now," she whispered. "It's because they sent me south so many times." He managed to smile in the dark. "It makes me sad," she frowned. "I feel so lucky." Silence. She squeezed into her tightly, trying to get a hold of the austere essence of their forlorn camaraderie, but then heaved him off. He stumbled back. He was quick to catch himself and return to the path, always so agile. Finally, she pulled herself out from the root knot gully, hopping back to the path too, only to find herself tugged forth by the wrist towards his body. They awkwardly met forms again, gear fumbling to creak sounds, a hesitant arrangement for clearing their heads of their bodies' intent. They looked straight on at each other. "We have to get within base camp range," he offered finally. Yeah, she coughed then, eyes shifting grim to the obscured horizon. Then they broke each other's glamour so they could run back to that ever-sacred range, the cybercom dispersal schema, where they could call Braga and Sully to reassemble and head home in time for tomorrow's dispersal back in the fucking domes. Kay already felt herself heavy with tears, but by this point she was veteran to tucking those feelings elsewhere. It wasn't time for that shit in the wilderness. If it was to be granted, they might get a lone hour to exact their mutual torments before carrying on into tomorrow and less lively days, batting eyes for progenitor maintenance crews and admin. Then back to Amwanga, out of sight, out of mind, till they needed more R&D data. And by then, Braga might have signed himself back out for another go at his death wish, and Sully would be back doing drugs in his air-conditioned dome condo. And Raul would be off wandering dead forests and writing poetry about his childhood across the sea, while she would be trying to get anyone to say her sad, injurious needs. Kay had one of those fleeting, unwanted thoughts that she had done this to herself by becoming a conversión total, that she should have dealt with her shit before putting herself in another body with all its own set of complicated environmental issues. She was a fool runaway in filth. No. That's not. Those are old values, old technologies. But it was probably true somewhere. She wasn't sure. They ran. Sometime later, a prompt message would blossom on their vision that Sully had set up base camp at this many kilometers away. They were within cybercom range. They were a half hour away. They had 2 hours. Kay slowed to a stop, Raw beside her. She glanced at him desperately, stepping nearer, bumping his hand, fingers entwined, slowly curling vines on each other till they crept elsewhere, anywhere they could within that unfacing tight range. They couldn't turn yet because it would be too full of quicksand, so they had to turn, slow, grind, force each other to it, to owning intent. Raul found himself angling closer, grasping for her fingers more decidedly as the degree ever sharpened, as she collapsed onto him with a sob, and his arms opened because he was stupefied at her honesty. She was all over him then, his back found against a boulder and her hands staying his throat while she bit at his mouth, his cries eerie in the dense air. They would slather spit on grimy skin, choking on each other in service, fighting against each other because Kay was in a heartbroken fury and Raul was devastated from his master. Sully and Braga would notice how the breathing dots of their posse lingered so close to base, the reason obvious to everyone with access to their schema. 2 boys in the wilderness looked like they were roughhousing. One pushed the other's face against an ancient boulder, skinning cheek and shoulder. He tugged violently and pulled for the purpose of winning, to expose less sun-seen skin, to spit in the palm, to claw cheek apart and jam palm against pucker, to spit there again and feed fingers prying inside. She would turn him around and force him to bended knee and splay his mouth, tears immediately, spit thick with mucus, the measure of oblivion understood through mutual destruction, consumption. Kay would replay the agony over and over and over, while sitting through a blistering summer day on Braga's stoop. Braga absent himself. She did so to mentor a group of young boys that had settled in some weeks prior. Where was Raul now off doing nature illustrations of mutated from the wildflowers or whatever, leaving Kay vulnerably in need of affection, trying to rationalize herself before hitting back a handful of calls from in-between lovers, trying to ignore the smoldering coals in her chest, the teary-eyed way it made her while still telling these kids something useful about the world. When I was y'all's age, this very block was getting stormed by this hired police army, Ellison, and Braga, who lives right there. He had his parents' gas right in his face. Damn, one marveled painfully. There wasn't shit here for them to take. They just wanted to secure the areas outside of the dome where they was putting up around the time when we all used to call it the Valley. It wasn't even a fucking city, but they ruined ours and then made their own shit up. Well, it's whatever, actually. It's all in the past. You can go hear more about it at Tuca's Storyteller House. They got some comics even. I just mean to let y'all know some history. History's important. You gotta hear it from as many people and places as you can. You hear me? The 3 preteens, sickly but adapting, gave their nodding acknowledgments to the intimidating but kindly neighborhood sage who had gathered them up from an aimless death trail on her way back from an errand run, center north. They didn't know that the way to the domes is mega corrupting and lethal, Probably the rumor that you just need to do the run within 2 days came from the domes even, she realized. Fucked up. She sighed and shook her head silently. And what Kay didn't say, staring absently down the remains of the block, was that you could still know history and find yourself doing the same bad shit over and over again, learning no lessons and making no new discoveries, meeting no one to challenge your perspectives because you had no future, and this was all that was left. It felt like it. And it was easy to forget the hope, the only shred of anything really around anymore, and sometimes it felt even sickly good to forget about the hope and to lament and rage and remember old songs, but you can't stay mad forever. You can't. You just own your sadness and you work on, ready, and maybe one of these days you'll feel different. Thank you.